Hello, my name's Tom, and it's Friday evening. That means final thoughts video because we are beginning or started already the Silverstone Grand Prix weekend, and it's a bit wet in Silverstone, so FP1 bit of a washout. But we're going to have a look at the FP1, FP2 results anyway. I'm going to be sharing my thoughts about just who I think are the best picks this weekend. I'm going to be looking at my team, which I've got on screen at the moment. I'm going to be showing you a couple of builds which I'm looking at. Pretty much similar to the video I did the other day, but I've got a bit more of an idea of exactly which one I'm probably leaning towards at the moment. It's very tight this weekend. It's looking pretty tight between the top teams. There's some improvements from some other teams, and we just need to kind of have a look at a few things and just get our thoughts kind of on the right track, so we can think clearly about the deadline, which is coming up obviously tomorrow at the time of recording this. So yeah, this video is literally just me talking, and hopefully listening to me talking is going to help you kind of process what you want to do with your teams. So yeah, like I said, this video is going to be me talking about my teams. We're going to have a look at the spreadsheet briefly, just to look at the FP1, FP2, and we're going to have a quick look at the end of the video at Twitter questions, because that's what we do here. If you want to follow me on Twitter, it's at Pop. Can't even say my own name. At PopPanmanF1 on Twitter. I do the Twitter questions like every race week. So yeah, if you want to throw your own questions into the arena at some point in the future, then follow me on Twitter. So and make sure you're subscribed as well on YouTube, because that's just what you do on YouTube. You click subscribe and you watch videos. That's the whole point of YouTube basically. So yeah, let's get into it. Let's have a look at the results, flick through the Twitter questions I got set up already, and we've got FP1, FP2. So FP1 we're going to talk very briefly about, because there's not much to say about it. It was very wet. You can see like the bottom half here, like everyone got like 1 or 2 laps in. It's just like, it's a bit wet out there. I think I'm just going to stay in the pit lane and just like chill out, talk to the engineers, have a cup of coffee, put my feet up pretty much. So yeah, the drivers didn't really do very much in terms of actual driving. Even like, if you look at the range of times that we've actually got, there's such a massive range that it's just really impossible to read into. The only, even like the likes of Sainz and Leclerc are like a second difference between them, which is just completely unrealistic in terms of what's going to happen during actual qualifying. Bearing in mind, in qualifying on Saturday, it does look like there's going to be quite a lot of rain, so it's going to be wet. So it's something to bear in mind, but I don't know how much we can read into it. I mean, I suppose you could look at like who the teams that perform well in the wet are, and in the cooler conditions so far, like the Red Bulls have been stronger in the cooler conditions so far, but I don't know how much we can read into decide our teams just based on like a couple of races, like Imola, for example, which was cool, and then also Canada was also a bit cooler, and Red Bulls performed well, but I don't know. I'm not going to read too much into it. Let's have a look at FP2. And again, a bit of a jumbled mess, to be honest. I mean, we've got quite a lot of laps in there, with the exception of Albon and Ocon. I'm not exactly sure what happened to Albon, but I know Ocon had a problem with his side pod, I believe, so he had a bit of a reliability issue there. New side pods for the Alpines. Lots of new upgrades coming in this weekend. It's just loads of upgrades, and it's kind of, I was really interested to see what would happen in FP1, FP2, and see where how that's shaking things up, but it's just a bit unclear, to be honest. Because if we look at what's going on here, you've got Carlos Sainz, who's only topped 1 practice session throughout the entire season so far. That was back in Australia. And then you've got Hamilton and Norris like making up the top 3. It's just like what McLaren have just been pretty poor over the last few races, and all of a sudden Norris just puts a really good lap together. And then you got Red Bulls are just struggling, like Max and Perez, and there was a lot of negativity coming out of the interviews, especially from Perez. He was saying that like they've had quite a few setbacks and it's just not looking great for Red Bull, so I'm a bit worried about Perez, to be honest. And if that continues into FP3 and the Red Bulls still don't look quite on there, then Perez is potentially quite an easy switch to Carlos Sainz. Carlos Sainz is on that qualifying streak, and he saves a little bit of money if you want to upgrade someone like Magnussen up to someone like Albon or something, if you want to do something like that. So yeah, the Red Bulls worry me slightly. Max Verstappen in his interview was slightly more, he was kind of like still held back, and Max Verstappen always tries to put a positive spin on things, but he seemed a little bit flat. I'm not going to lie, in his interview, this seemed a little bit flat, and he was like, yeah, it wasn't great, but it was okay, and he was like trying to put that positive spin on it. But in general, I kind of got the vibe that Max wasn't super happy with it. But nevertheless, the Red Bulls are Red Bulls, and Red Bulls do what they do, and that is like they just kind of smash it every weekend, regardless of what happens in the practice session. So although what's happened so far in the practice session, or in FP2 anyway, and the interviews afterwards, does give me some pause for thought about the Red Bulls, and gives me more confidence going for a Ferrari as a constructor this weekend. I wouldn't read too much into it. I still expect the Red Bulls to be strong, but keep an eye on FP3, because I think it's going to be kind of interesting to see what happens there. Interestingly, Leclerc quite off it compared to Carlos Sainz, half a second there. And the thing is, it's very difficult to read into it because FP1 was like just complete washout. They've had to adjust their programs in FP2, and there was probably less of a qualifying, less of the short runs, and more. I don't know. I think the whole program's just been kind of messed up and turned on its head a little bit, and it's a lot more difficult to read into it. For example, George Russell and Hamilton, a big differential of like 7-8 tenths of a second between the two. So you're thinking, oh, Hamilton's like miles ahead of Russell, but Russell went out on the hard tyres, whereas Hamilton went out early on the soft tyres. And then Russell went back onto the soft tyres later on, and it was hard to warm them up. I just think that all the programs are all like mixed up, and I'm not convinced that these practice session times are particularly representative of what's going on. But anyway, I think that's enough kind of waffling about F1, FP2. We can talk more about F1, FP2 as we actually look at the teams. If I go into my team here, and I'm going to shove the team straight on there, and we'll see what we're going to do with it. Doesn't require Ferrari. I do want Leclerc in my team. This is one of the teams I'm kind of considering, and there are ways we can tweak this. For example, Perez, if we're not happy, we could kind of go more all in on without any Red Bulls and go all in Ferrari, which I'm not particularly happy with, but it's a possibility, and that would enable us to upgrade Kevin Magnussen to someone like Alex Albon if you wanted to. But I think I'm more likely, despite Red Bull's kind of woes at the moment, to have Perez in there as some sort of Red Bull cover. And that would enable me to put either Latifi or Magnussen in. I'll talk about Latifi and Magnussen in just a minute, but I want to talk about the actual more important drivers where the main bulk of our points are going to be. So this team is pretty well balanced, I think. It does enable us to get Alonso, who's on that race streak. The Alpines are the big upgrades, and in FP, where if we flick back, FP2, where it's the most representative times we've got at the moment, even though I don't think they're great. You know, Fernando Alonso in P6, where's Ocon down P13, but he did have that issue which sort of set him back a bit. So Alonso, kind of as a standard this season, is doing really well in the practice sessions. And we saw in Canada what happened in the wet with Fernando Alonso, like just amazing basically. Did really well in the wet, and can we expect to see something similar this weekend? I don't think probably quite to that extent, especially not with the Mercedes kind of looking a bit better this weekend. I don't think Alonso's going to be quite getting on the front row, but I wouldn't rule it out. He's like threatened it in Australia. He did it in Canada. Like some wet conditions here, a bit of a mix-up. You could see Alonso doing really well, and I think he's just an easy, like, out of all the mid-range sort of price drivers, when you're looking at the likes of Vettel, Ocon, Bottas, anyone in like Gasly, anyone in that sort of price range, with Fernando Alonso being on that race streak and with the upgrades that they brought in, I just think it's just an easy pick. Like, you don't have to overthink it. You can really overthink fantasy sometimes, and it's like, he's on the streak. He's pretty well priced. I know he's not had the best, most consistent season so far, but, you know, like, it's kind of 10 points kind of just sat there on the table for the taking. So I'm quite happy to have Alonso in my team, even though I think he has been a bit of a fantasy troll so far this season. But anyway, moving on, Leclerc back in the team. And now arguably, obviously with the results from FP2, Leclerc outperformed by Sainz. Do we arguably want Carlos Sainz instead of Leclerc because he's on that quali streak? Just on next, you know, you could even argue that you want Sainz over Leclerc for turbo driver reasons, because it's very likely. Well, I say very likely. If it's wet, you never know what's going to happen in qualifying, but it is still likely that Sainz will get in the top 10 and quite easily get those 5 points, which if he's turbo drive then becomes 10 points, and that's just immediately 10 points more than whatever Leclerc is able to produce. But I do think probably across the actual race, Leclerc is probably more likely to be just a better position than Carlos Sainz. So I do think that probably Leclerc is still the best pick, but I wouldn't look down on anyone picking Carlos Sainz over Leclerc. But I do think Leclerc is still my preferred option, just because he's shown that pure consistency across the season. Although Carlos Sainz has picked up in the last couple of races, and like I say, he's on that quali streak, so you could kind of argue either way. But yeah, for now, Leclerc's in the team, and we'll see what happens in FP3 anyway. I've already kind of touched on Perez and Red Bull. Not super exciting at the moment, but I do think in general the Red Bulls are just the most solid team across the season so far, and I think having at least some coverage from them is really important. So I'm quite happy to have Perez just sat there for now. Russell, I've spoken about kind of extensively in my last two videos, and I think for me personally, it's just a very, again, similar reasons to Alonso really. I know he's a lot more expensive, but it's just very easy to just put him in there. He's on the double streak, home race. Again, wet conditions looking at qualifying. Russell, I know he didn't do super well in the wet in Canada, but it's because he tried putting on the soft tyres when everyone else on the intermediates. He tried to be clever, it didn't pay off, but I don't think he's going to make that same mistake again necessarily. And he's historically been good, especially in qualifying in the wet. So I think Russell could be a really good shout. in terms of that, and also just the fact he's on that double streak, and looking ahead to next week in Austria, where I want to bring in Max Verstappen for the Mega Driver on the sprint race, and Russell is in that price point where it just makes it a lot easier. Like, for example, I can quite easily go from Russell to Verstappen next week, and then just bring down, for example, Perez down to a mid-range driver like alongside Alonso, like Ocon, Bottas. You can quite easily fill in the gaps. And if I want to go for a build which involves Red Bull as my constructor, and I want to get Verstappen in next week, then that's an even easier switch of going Russell to Verstappen and then Red Bull down to Ferrari. It's like a kind of, Russell's about 6 million cheaper than Red Bull, and Ferrari about 6 million cheaper than Red Bull. Sorry, Russell than Verstappen, and Ferrari to Red Bull. So it's quite an easy switch that way. If I've at all made sense, I think I've confused myself now, let alone confuse anyone who's watching this video. But anyway, that's enough talking about that. Let's talk briefly about Magnussen versus Latifi/Albon. I think if you can afford Albon, if you have the budget in this sort of range, I'm 0.3 short, very close to being able to afford Albon, which would be great. I'm sure there's quite a few people out there that can afford this with their budget, and if I could choose out of Albon, Latifi, Schumacher, Magnussen in that price range, I would definitely be choosing Albon. He's got those upgrades on his car, Mercedes engine in the car, looking consistent. He's almost certainly going to beat Latifi. I think Albon's just an easy pick if you can afford him. I unfortunately cannot afford him in this build, so I'd have to kind of decide between Latifi and Magnussen. I don't want Schumacher. I think Magnussen, if I'm going to pick a Haas driver, I would go for Magnussen. Magnussen, versus Latifi is a bit of a tough one. Like I say, the Haas could do well in the wet conditions. They've proven to do well in the wet conditions so far in qualifying. So you could see, for example, Magnussen stick it into Q3 and then be kind of set up for a potentially good race. But then you've also got the fact that they brought an upgrade as well, so they might be able to hold position. But there is also that big risk where we've seen fairly repeatedly so far this season, Magnussen qualifying pretty well, but then just dropping back in the race, and then you just end up losing points for positions lost. And so whereas Latifi is almost guaranteed to qualify, 18th, 19th, 20th, pretty much, and therefore any DNFs ahead of him are kind of just points in the bag, really. So it kind of goes, kind of balancing. Do you want someone who's going to qualify well and then drop back, or do you want someone who's going to be rubbish at qualifying and go forward? So personally, I think in that sort of price range, I'd rather have someone who's qualifying further back and going forward. So I'd probably lean towards Latifi, but at the end of the day, it's probably like the difference of like 5 to 10 points, which in the grand scheme of things is not really that significant, but it's still something we need to bear in mind when we're picking our team. So anyway, that's one build I've got there. Like I said, there's some tweaks we can do to that. But we're going to have a look at the next build because I feel like I've already been talking for absolutely ages. Let's move on. Okay, so here we are back with the next team. And I kind of like this team. It does look kind of nice. But it does mean I have to, I don't have to decide between Magnussen and Latifi because I got the best of both worlds and I got both of them on my team. Yay! That's the only downside to this team, really, is the fact that I would have to have Latifi plus Magnussen. But if you kind of just ignore, if we just like cover up, make my mouse cursor a bit bigger, ignore Latifi, kind of ignore Magnussen, the rest of the team looks pretty fantastic, I would say. I mean, like I said, I've touched on the Red Bulls already, not convinced, but I have faith. And if they look better tomorrow, do some setup changes, whatever they need to do, and look a bit better in FP3, and you want to go for the Red Bull build, then I do think that this team offers some decent value because you've got Leclerc, stick the turbo driver on him, don't think too much more about it. That covers you quite nicely for Leclerc doing well. Doesn't get you any signs coverage, but you can't have everyone. Like, there's only 6 slots in the entire team. You can't have everyone. There's going to be someone that you're missing out on, and this team means no signs on his streak, whatever. It does also mean you're missing out on Alonso. This one, like I said, I've already touched on Alonso, saying that I think he's a pretty safe option and we should be looking at like 20-25 points like fairly comfortably for Fernando Alonso, providing there's no disasters. And I think that's great value at someone. He's looking at potentially like 2 points per million on this race, so I do think Alonso is a good pick, and this does kind of ignore Alonso with this build, but it does cover Max Verstappen's points, and I don't want Max Verstappen as an individual driver this week because of the prices and everything. I'd rather switch to him next week for the Mega Driver, so I don't want to preemptively bring him in. So if I want a team that looks kind of like this, like I say, the downside is Latifi plus Magnussen, but the main bulk of points all come from the big drivers at the end of the day. Like, we'd want to try and avoid DNF drivers, and the only real DNF threat here is Magnussen. You could argue Leclerc, but I think it's less likely with that brand new engine from Canada. So I think, it's a pretty well-rounded team, I'd say. And again, fairly easy switch. Like I say, for next week, if I wanted to bring in, well, I do want to bring in Max Verstappen as mega driver, I could quite easily just go like chunk down to Ferrari. Verstappen comes in for Russell, and that leaves me with 0.3. That's like a straight swap, and I can just have a team like this for Austria, and that looks fine. So yeah, it's quite an easy switch there already. So I quite like to look at that, and then we're going to have a look at one more build briefly, and then we're going to go on to Twitter questions. So bear with me 2 seconds. And here we are again. So this is actually the same team that I showed in my previous video, and I've thought a bit more about it, and I think this is again another nice balanced team. Thinking more on it, less convinced purely because there's less coverage from the best two teams, which are Ferrari and Red Bull. So it does worry me slightly, kind of spreading the funds quite this much. But we are looking at kind of reliability-wise, looking kind of safe. Again, we've got two Ferrari engines in the mix, which isn't, but there's always going to be some sort of reliability issue in your team. You can't really fix that. This build does enable you to get Red Bull. It gives you that Max Verstappen coverage to quite a large extent. Gives you the Alonso pick on that streak. Gives you the Russell easy build. Again, easy switch from Russell to Max Verstappen next week. And again, you could just switch Red Bull to Ferrari. Boom, Bob's your uncle. There's your team done, sort of thing for next week. Stroll and Bottas are interesting. Bottas obviously top of FP1. Whoa, amazing. He's the best driver, turbo driving. But no, Bottas just across the season has been really consistent. I think he's fine to get in there. I don't think he's particularly exciting anymore. I think he's just kind of almost like, I don't know. I feel like every week we're trying to put in like the more shiny, fun driver, but just in the background, Bottas is just quietly going about his work, just like smashing it every week. And I think Bottas is just arguably like season keeper sort of material, but he keeps finding his way out of my team, and I think that could be a mistake. Thinking about, I could be trying to be like just too clever and trying to wedge in too much other stuff going on, but. Like, let's briefly look at his scores over the last few races. 20, 14, 26, 23. He doesn't even cost 10 million. It's under 10 million, and he's smashing out like 2 points per million each race, basically, or even more in like an Imola and that. So, yeah, I do think Bottas is a great pick. And then Stroll. I mean, Stroll, you could argue with my budget 9.4. If you've got the bit more money, maybe you can stretch it for. Probably can't get to Vettel, but you could argue like Albon if you think he's a safer pick than Stroll, but. Yeah, Albon versus Stroll is kind of a similar sort of pick, really. But I do kind of like this team. It's well balanced. At the moment, like I say, I was really hoping that FP1, FP2 were going to give us more information, but we haven't got a lot to go on. So I'm kind of still a bit between the three builds I've shown so far. But I am leaning. If I had to pick one right now, if you like pointed a gun at me and was like, pick a team, Tom, I'd be like, I'd probably pick the first team that I showed, the Ferrari constructor, Russell, Leclerc, Perez, Alonso, and Latifi / Magnussen. I think that's quite a good team, and it's just well balanced. And the only problem with that, basically the only problem with that team is that you don't get any of Max Verstappen's points, which does worry me slightly because I think Max Verstappen's just he's just a points machine. But apart from the max factor, then I'm really happy with that Team 1 build, to be honest. So anyway. So we're moving on to the final part of the video now, where I'm going to answer Twitter questions. Follow me on Twitter at PopPamanF1 if you want to do this in future. Just chuck some questions out there, and I'm going to go through it as best I can. So first question, do you think budget enabler market for drivers still offers any value? Haas drivers are unreliable and Williams are slow. Yeah, I think so, because the way I think about Haas and Williams are kind of like the necessary kind of evils in our team, and they're not even evil, are they? Really, they're just not very high scoring points. But if you can get someone that's not going to DNF, someone's going to finish the race and just trying to accumulate some points from other people DNFing, then I think that's fine. The Haas have the tendency to qualify quite well and then drop back in the race. So in fact, let's have a quick look at the spreadsheet quickly. We can see here. Where are we? Down the bottom here. If we highlight these bottom people here, so you've got Albon and Latifi. You can see the points that they've gained across the season is like really, really good. Just purely, well, not purely, but mainly from people DNFing ahead of them. Albon arguably doing some actual decent racing and tyre management, etc. But you can see the differential between the Williams and the Haas. So this is why a lot of people are moving away from the likes of Magnussen, moving on to someone like Latifi or Albon, because I mean, look at the difference there. It's like 50, 60 points you're looking at just because of where they're finishing the race. And yeah, you get points if you manage to qualify well. Like Magnussen has got into Q3 a couple of times and generally doing like all right, but then it just sets you up if you don't have that race pace, or if something goes wrong, which has happened. Magnussen's had a couple of kind of minor collisions, which has led to him having damage or going off track, like in Spain, damage in Canada, that sort of thing. It just means you're just immediately losing like 10 points from whatever. So if you gain like 10 points from doing qualifying well, and you immediately lose 10 points because your race hasn't gone so well, you're already back to like 0 points, and then how are you going to claw any respectability back in terms of fantasy there? So yeah, I think if you're going to go for a budget enabler, and I think most teams will have budget enablers because we're trying to pack in the meat of the Red Bulls, Ferraris, etc., George Russell, that sort of thing, then I think pretty much everyone's team is going to have at least one of these budget drivers. And I think if at the moment, I think it's sensible to go for someone like Latifi or Albon if you can afford him. Let's throw it back to Ian Morris. Thank you very much. I know you said Russell this week is a great placeholder for Verstappen next week. Yep. And my question is, why not go straight for Verstappen this week? He's probably most likely to win, whilst Russell, with his streak bonuses, will probably finish P4, P6. Yeah, I think it's a perfectly reasonable thing, and I think you could argue. I mean, you are arguing doing exactly that, but I think this week it makes sense to me to have Russell because he's cheaper than Verstappen, so you don't have to kind of warp your team around. Bringing Verstappen into your team, you then have to probably drop someone like Alonso down to someone like Latifi. So if you think Alonso is going to score like 20, 30 points this week if he does well, and you're dropping him down to someone like Magnussen or Latifi, who kind of a good case scenario is like 10 to 15 points probably you're looking at, so you're immediately missing out on some points there. And the fact that Russell's on this double streak, it kind of draws him, it brings him closer to Verstappen's point scoring likelihood anyway. And I know Verstappen's on the qualifying streak, but with Russell, just the price point and the fact that he's on the double streak just makes it kind of an easy pick, just gives you that more balanced approach. And my outlook on fantasy in general is to really have kind of a more balanced team as much as I can, and having Verstappen in your team long term is kind of detrimental. I've said it before, like if you're going to have Verstappen, have him as a constructor, have Red Bull as a constructor to kind of cover him, then you're only missing out on the few like beating the teammate points sort of thing. But I only really want Verstappen in my team next week because I'm going to be mega driving him. And I said it a couple of weeks ago as well, like looking at Baku, and I was talking about would I have, I think Verstappen was a really good, like really popular pick going into Baku because everyone got really excited about him, and he did do really well, but it was to the detriment of the rest of the team. And I think people that ended up going with Verstappen, unless they put the mega driver on him, actually ended up probably losing out because they probably ended up going Ferrari as their constructor in Baku, and Ferrari, I think they double DNF'd in Baku, didn't they? So, I mean, I don't know. I just feel like putting Verstappen in your team long term isn't optimal because of the balance. So yeah, kind of. I guess I hope that answers your question. It's all about balance for me. So there you go. I can never say your name. I'm sorry, Jack. I'm gonna say Jack. A similar sort of question, really. Are you looking to keep Verstappen in? Worth bringing Russell in? Yeah, I mean, I've already gone through my team selection already, and I do think that Ferrari as constructor are arguably looking pretty strong so far. Like FP2 was a bit of a mishmash of what's going on, but I think when it's that close between Ferrari and Red Bull, I think you can get away with putting Ferrari as your constructor. Generally speaking, especially over the last few races, the Red Bulls have been really, really strong and just powering through, like getting all the points, but I think as long as Ferrari have got that reliability, they've got some new engine parts, that they should be more reliable over the next couple of races. And I think it's kind of fine to have Ferrari as a constructor, and therefore, I think it's absolutely a good choice to bring in Russell this week. So yeah. Oscar, this question: if I can only pick one out of Perez, Leclerc, or actually, I have to clarify this question. So what you mean by this question is, if I pick Russell and I can only have two out of Perez, Leclerc, or Sainz, who would I pick? With Ferrari as constructor. So if you ignore Perez, you're then going to Leclerc, Sainz, and Ferrari constructor, and that means you're going all in on Ferrari. And if we think back to like literally a week or two ago, everyone was panicking about Ferrari and their reliability. They keep DNFing. Everyone's like trying to move off them and pile on Red Bull. And all of a sudden we're like, oh, let's just triple on Ferrari. Like, what could possibly go wrong? And while I think the reliability issues are less likely to come up in the next couple of races, it's still a very real possibility. Across the season, we've seen just consistently the Ferrari engines, Alfa Romeo and Haas having issues. The Ferraris do worry me slightly in that regard, and going all in on them at the moment, I'm not convinced by it. So I do think Perez and Leclerc are my favourite options at the moment. You could argue Sainz with the qualifying streak and the good performance in FP2, just a general uptick in his performance recently, but I think in general I would probably go Leclerc, Perez. Who is the best driver to pair with Russell? That's a similar sort of question again. One wants to know the same thing. Perez or Leclerc? If I could only pick out of Perez and Leclerc, I would definitely be picking Leclerc. I think he's, even though Sainz is coming back into it a bit more, I think Leclerc is more likely to be beating his teammate. I think Perez, although he's done really well recently, is less likely to do well against Max Verstappen as a teammate. And Leclerc, I don't know. I just think he's going to be on form this week. He's got like that new engine in the back of his Ferrari. He showed some good pace in Canada coming through the field, and yeah, I think definitely I'd be picking Leclerc. And then the final question from Stan. I say final question because I believe you've put about 3 questions in here, but I'll do my best to answer them. Which driver have you found the most exciting this year? So this is, I guess you can answer this in terms of fantasy or in terms of just general F1. And I think I had a little think about this when I saw this question a couple of days ago, and I was thinking, who is the most exciting? And I don't know if everyone would agree with me on this, but I'd argue Fernando Alonso has been the most exciting this year. He's like the oldest driver on the grid. He's just like, most people have retired by now, and he's out there just like loving life, living his best life out there, just driving fast every week. He's been really exciting in a couple of qualifying sessions. We think back to Australia and that purple sector and what could have been on the front row, possible pole position. How exciting was that, watching that lap? And then, moments before disaster as the end, they pan over to Fernando Alonso. You think he's going to be going for that third sector, lighting up purple once again and fighting for pole, and then he's in the wall, and it's just like, ah! But, that's exciting. And also, like Canada, I think what happened literally just in the last race where, he dominated through the wet practice sessions and into qualifying, put on the front row. Like, that's super exciting. I know he's not been doing super well in the races, but I think just in general, out of everyone on the grid, I think, my answer would be Fernando Alonso. I think he's just providing some entertainment. he's always got a smile on his face, it seems. So yeah, it's good to watch. Which driver is the most essential for all fantasy teams? I never really think of anyone as essential, but if you forced me to pick someone as essential, I'd say Charles Leclerc. I think he's massively underpriced. He's in a car capable of winning any given race, and under 20 million you can turbo drive him as well. I think it's just screaming like pick Leclerc like every week basically. So yeah, I'd definitely say Leclerc to answer that. And then finally, any tips for effectively increasing your budget week by week? Honestly, I could do a whole video on this and as to what you can do, but also the fact that the Hacker Man still seems to be kind of active. Don't know what Playon are doing, if anything, because they don't communicate with us. So Hacker Man still seems to be out there having his fun, hiding away in some dark room somewhere, probably just like giggling to himself as he brings in Williams and cranks their price up by almost $1 million. But yeah, I think with the Hacker Man impact this year, it's really and play on who are the people behind the game just not communicating what's going on. It's very, very difficult to know what's going on. You can kind of monitor what's going on, the price changes, but we've seen people soaring up to like 98-99%, or we've seen it with like so far we've had Perez and Alonso looking very likely to tick over in the last week, and then all of a sudden they're frozen and then they're just not really moving, and it's very difficult to predict what's happening. So at the moment, all I'm trying to do is just pick the best drivers, the best team I possibly can, and just kind of hope that with that my budget kind of naturally, it's not just Hackerman. Hackerman's not the only one out there affecting what's going on. There are still some movements occasionally based on like the masses actually, organically changing the market. And I think just having the good drivers in your team should get you that budget in theory, but it's really hard to predict right now. So I'm sorry, I really can't answer that question probably too effectively at the moment until Hackerman, stop, please stop. So anyway, that's all the Twitter questions. That's me done for now. I'm going to post my team on YouTube, on the YouTube community tab, a little bit before the deadline tomorrow. I say tomorrow if you're watching this on the deadline day, then today I'm going to post my team. So yeah, make sure you'll stay tuned for that. At the moment, like I say, I'm leaning kind of more towards that Ferrari constructor build. But we'll see. It could go anywhere at the moment. So we'll see what FP3 brings, and then I'll make my mind up tomorrow and post it there. So yeah, I'll see you in a couple of days for team selection for Austria, because it's straight round, straight out of Silverstone into the mountains of Austria, and there we are with Mega Driver Max, blah blah blah, all sorts kicking off. So yeah, see you next week, everyone. Thanks so much for watching. I hope I haven't bored you to death by talking the hind legs of a horse or whatever. But yeah, thanks so much for watching. Be back next week. Thanks very much. Bye bye.